Okay.
We can, yep.
All right. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my company. I started at this business in 1995. The business was owned by my father and uncle, who came at it from a local hardware store in Lyme, New Hampshire, where we had a big hearth shop. We used to sell somewhere between 200 and 250 stoves per year. We had this central heating component that had always been fairly stable. And the guy who was importing tar and boilers at that time wanted to end that. He saw this really cool thing coming on called the internet, and wanted to jump into that and start a website. And he wanted to get rid of the boiler, so he called us up or called my father and uncle up and said, "Hey boys, what do you say?" And so anyhow, they began importing boilers in '95. I was fresh out of college in a short stint in Anchorage, Alaska, with a buddy of mine, doing really nothing except making a buck and exploring. And they called and said, "Hey, do you want to work here selling boilers?" And yeah. So anyhow, here I am 25 years later. We began selling I think what was the first bulk pellet boiler in the United States back in 2001. Began with automatic pellet boilers in 2009. At this point, don't even import tar and boilers anymore. We still support them, but our primary brand is Furlan. So without any further ado, today I'm going to talk about what makes a thermal energy source relevant in Vermont. And I actually got to believe that this list on the left is really what makes any energy source relevant. And I may not have these in the correct order, but I believe they stand for almost any energy source. But I hope by the end of this presentation to sort of prove that advanced wood heat still has a place. It's still relevant because it does meet the needs of this list. And I'll be coming at this primarily from the standpoint of hot water boilers, not pellet stoves, not wood stoves, and primarily not furnaces, but hot water boilers. So if I tend to make generalizations, that's why. So before I get too far into it, I just want to show you guys this chart, which shows the current thermal fuel mix in the state of Vermont. As you can see, about 75% of the thermal mix is fossil fuel. So there's a huge opportunity here, or in other words, a need. About 2 out of 10 Vermonters use natural gas, which surprised me. 6 of 10 use heating oil. It's one of the most heating oil dependent states in the nation. A fun fact, not so fun for people in the renewable energy business, is that Vermont uses about 4 times as much energy as it makes, which means that Vermont is a big importer. Another interesting fact is that 34% of the energy use in Vermont is residential energy use. So it's a pretty big slice of the pie. And of that residential energy use, 75% is for heat. So there's a lot of emphasis these days on renewable power, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the biggest nut to crack, or the lowest hanging fruit in another term of speech, is thermal. So whether it's heat pumps or advanced wood heating, there's a huge opportunity.
Looks like you got a question, Scott.
Okay.
I raised my hand. So will this slide deck be available for us to review after?
I have no problem with that. Absolutely.
Okay. So could you send it to the people that are on this meeting right now? Once we get finished, that would be fantastic. So we could have a chance to look at it and review all of the stuff that you've shared with us so far.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And one thing that I do not do is I do not make typewritten notes on my PowerPoint presentation. So some of what I'm saying is not going to be on the PowerPoint, but maybe I can add some notes for you.
No, totally fine. We can take our own notes, but just the content in general would be super helpful. So thank you, Scott.
Sure. I'm not sure. Oh, this is weird. Okay, so I borrowed this particular slide from Adam Sherman. You guys might have heard of him or know him, but I didn't realize that each line came in individually during the slideshow. So this is a little bit more granular dive into Vermont home heating. This certainly isn't the whole breadth of heating. This is just residential. 164,000 single-family homes. They're on average 2,100 square feet. And this is a little bit of a bizarre way of talking about heating, but each home uses about 63,000 BTUs per square foot. We don't talk that way in the heating industry. So I did a little math so that you guys could understand what exactly that means. And what it means is that each 2,100 square foot house in Vermont uses on average about 950 gallons of oil, about 1,400 gallons of propane, or 6.5 cords of wood, or 8.25 tons of wood pellets. So those are all equivalents. And the point of the next line is just to point out that we could reduce the heating demand with some weatherization by about 25%. So obviously weatherization is a huge opportunity for us. What's great for my business is that 60% of the homes have boilers, and about 98,000 have boilers, 46,000 have furnaces. A lot of people use those terms interchangeably. A lot of times people call a boiler a furnace and a furnace a boiler, but a boiler is hot water and a furnace is hot air. And also a lot of homes have central heat, so there's a big opportunity for advanced wood heat because a lot of those systems, as I'll show later, are hard to dovetail with the other common renewable energy source, which is heat pumps. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. I was trying to raise my hand. I'm not sure if it was working.
You know, I can't see it because I'm trying to look so you guys can see my eyes, and I can't see when you raise your hand. I'm sorry. So
yeah,
just
not getting any indication that it's actually being raised on my end.
okay.
Would you mind just repeating the note? I just want to take a quick note on the BTU equivalents. That was helpful.
Yeah, so it's so it's approximately 950 gallons of oil.
Yeah.
1,420 gallons of propane.
Yeah.
6.5 cords of wood, or 8.25 tons of wood pellets. That's without any reduction for efficiencies. That is just straight up how much energy is available in a volume of fuel.
And that's based approximately on a 2,100 square foot, 63,000 BTU.
Yep. And I'd say that's a little bit high. That seems like to me a house that's not well insulated, or perhaps this is a year-round figure, which includes energy use for domestic water heating. So I think it's all thermal uses, not just heat, space heat.
Does that include the adjusted efficiency calculation of the heating system as well?
No, it definitely doesn't. This is just pure energy input.
Okay.
And so, speaking and from my world, I can tell you that even though a cord of wood theoretically has a lot more energy in it than a ton of pellets, they're roughly the same in use, because the pellets will provide you with a little bit more efficiency.
Thank you.
Sure, and please feel free to speak up. I'd rather do it this way for a small group than to save everything for the end.
Okay.
So I'll show you what these systems look like. This is a neat drawing of a pellet system. This is a bit outdated and a bit simplified, but the main parts are here. What you see is there is a tanker truck backed up with a hose, which is how it works, usually a 4-inch hose, and they like to keep that hose length to 75 feet or less. So there is a little bit of a challenge in finding an area for bulk fuel that a truck can get to. Whereas with oil or propane, they can use a very small, by comparison, much more flexible and much longer hose. This pellet hose from the truck it's big. It's 4 inches long, in diameter. Each piece is 20 feet long, and it's sort of rigidized and also grounded, so it has a steel mesh built in. It's very heavy, and so these guys don't like stringing these things together and locking them together out in the field, especially if they're in snow, because then snow gets in the hose and water and pellets don't mix. So anyway, we try to keep that run as short as possible. The pellet bin you see here is actually built into a room, which is atypical, actually, and I'll show you on the next slide what the typical storage looks like. We like to see pellet bins that are 3 tons or larger to reduce the number of truck trips, which keeps the cost of the fuel down. And then in this drawing, you can see that there is a rigid auger feeding the boiler, which is actually not common anymore. The most common means for delivering fuel from the bulk bin to the boiler is actually through air hoses. And then after that, it's pretty much a typical system. I suppose this drawing does show a buffer tank. It's not just a pure domestic hot water tank. And the purpose of that buffer tank is to reduce the on-off cycles of the pellet boiler. So the pellet boiler runs until that tank starts to get hot. Then the pellet boiler will modulate down to about 1/3 of its output. And it'll continue to heat that tank. And eventually that tank will be full of heat and the boiler can add no more. And the boiler will actually shut off. But it won't restart again until that tank is depleted of heat. So there is a much longer duration between on and off cycles for the boiler. This next slide is a much simpler picture of the same thing, except that the bin is this typical cloth bin. This is basically like a heavy-duty polyester bag with metal running through it, very flexible metal for static dissipation, and it's suspended on a wooden frame. It's actually glue lam. It's not just pure wood. It's actually laminated wood, because the average bin is probably around 5 tons. So there's a lot of weight strung on that wood. The boiler is the red box with the gray side, and then above that you'll see a little red cube, and that red cube is a vacuum motor. It's the same type of motor that is used in car wash vacuums, actually. So it's very strong, and it pulls fuel through a 2-inch hose and then returns the air on a separate hose back to the bin. So it's actually not just a vacuum, it's a more of a loop where the fuel comes in one side and air goes back the other way. And when the air goes back into the bin, it agitates the fuel, it stirs it up so that it's the fuel's not coming through the hose as one big slug, it's coming through as little bits and bobs. The other thing is that this bag is shown with a little short stub sticking out of the top of it, and that's not how it's done. The delivery companies want that to be piped to the outside, so we use rigid steel or aluminum pipe from the bag through the sidewall of the house somewhere, and the truck can pull up and just connect right to it, and the same way an oil truck would connect to a pipe and begin filling the bin.
What would be the size of a 5-ton bag like that as far
Yes,
as
that's,
dimensions?
I'm glad you asked. It's between 8 and 10 feet square, and about 7 feet tall. There are different companies that have different bag configurations. Some have rectangular bags. Some have bags that are suspended on springs that actually don't have such a big V on the bottom, and as the fuel is pulled out, the springs pull up on the bag, turning it into a V. There are a lot of different formulas for this kind of factory-built storage. We've actually reduced the V shape to a more obtuse angle in the last few years so that we can store more fuel. And we add a small vibrator to the bottom. And so if the fuel does not pull through because there's an opening above it, and then the fuel's stuck up on the corners of the bag, that vibrator turns on, and the fuel just slides right down to the suction point again. It's pretty cool. I'm not sure if it's clear from this picture, but the top is fully enclosed. So when the truck makes a connection to these, it actually first blows air in, massive quantities of air, and inflates that bag, sort of like Pop Secret popcorn or whatever that camp popcorn is that you put on a burner and it expands like crazy, like camping popcorn. And then they blow the fuel in. So it's a fully enclosed, dust-free storage. If it's a built-in wooden bin, it has to be built extremely tight and then sealed with silicone or some other kind of rubbery plastic sealant, or else the dust will just come out all over the place. That's one major advantage of these cloth bags. So this next slide is sort of an interesting one because it speaks to the unique readiness of biomass or advanced wood heat. What you see here is actually 333 images of Tesla Generation 2 Powerwalls. And the point here is that in 1 quart of wood, or approximately 1 ton of wood pellets, you have as much energy stored as you have in 333 fully charged Tesla Powerwalls. So it's sort of something taken for granted that we can have a wood pile out in the shed, or we can store pellets in the basement. But what it really means is that we have this energy source on tap 24 hours a day, regardless of the temperature, regardless of cloud cover, and it's always ready. So it's pretty amazing from that standpoint. And I don't mean to diminish the value of Tesla Powerwalls. I think it's a great technology. It's just that the point is wood is really, really powerful by comparison. And I actually reduced the number of Powerwalls for the conversion efficiency of wood. So if you took it, the value of the wood at 100%, in other words, you could extract every last BTU out of it, or every last kilowatt out of that quart of wood, you'd actually have 430 Powerwalls. So it's just an amazing amount of energy stored in wood. So what do these systems look like in real life? I'm going to show you a few pictures. This one I like because it's almost exactly like the drawing I just showed you. You can actually see the white cloth bin, and it's got pellets in it. You can see because it's very taut. And you can see the little red box where the vacuum is located, and you can see the hoses that go from the bin through the white box to the boiler. This was a fairly unique installation, and despite the fact that they had 7 German Shepherds in crates in the basement, and the place was a mess, it was fun to work on. They actually wanted to have not only bulk fuel, but they wanted to be able to fill their boiler with bags. And these boilers can't actually be filled with bags. There's no door, there's no hatchway that you can open up to put the bags in, at least not very easily. You've got to unscrew things, unbolt things. And so what we did for them is we added this brown box that you can see in the background. And that is a bin that they can dump bags into. And that box holds about 700 pounds of wood pellets and has the same hose connections that the big bulk bin has. So if they ever get in trouble, the bulk bin can't make it up their driveway in the winter, or if they forget to order pellets until it's too late and the bulk guy is busy, they can run down to Home Depot and get some bags to get them by and still have a fairly automatic situation. The other thing we did at this site that I enjoyed thinking about was that instead of adding a buffer tank with this pellet boiler to reduce the on-off cycles, we added a really big heat pump hot water heater. And the reason we did that is that these folks had a 10 kW PV array on their barn. And there was no way they were going to use that much power in the summer months. And knowing that they get more bang for their buck if they use that power on site, I suggested that they use this heat pump hot water heater during the summer months. They have been really, really happy with it. We oversized the heat pump so that they could run in heat pump only mode rather than using any resistance heating. And we left it like that in the most efficient mode. And they've never called us to say, hey, how do you get more heat out of this thing? So that's worked. And from our standpoint, because the pellet boiler is not running just to meet small domestic hot water heating loads, it is not cycling that much. So they were extremely happy with this boiler. They completely replaced all of their cordwood and oil use last winter. So that worked out really well. I'm not going to do a whole lot about cordwood, but I do think that cordwood is underrated in its capabilities, especially with the new boilers. The boiler in this picture is, you can't see them, but it's actually connected to big buffer tanks. This is connected to 600 gallons of water. And so this customer will fill the boiler about 3/4 full with cordwood.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't think you saw my hand was raised from the previous slide, but if you go back one slide, you were
Yeah.
talking about the brown box in the back.
Yeah.
And then also how you were able to sort of offset some of their fossil fuel usage. Do you have any numbers about how much that increased their electrical consumption in terms of dollars and cents?
I don't, because I'm so unfocused on power in my business. I'm really focused on heat. And yeah, I wouldn't even want to venture a guess. It would get pretty complicated for them because they had that big PV system. Even if they used more power because they were using it on site, I'm not sure that the dollars and cents would have been that much different. It's a great question. I might just ask them actually.
Yeah, I was just curious, and just wondering from a customer perspective about how they performed and if they were actually seeing real savings in terms of their cost, or if it was just fuel savings alone and the cost was even. So, and of course, across the country, the costs are different. So we're just wondering if you had any experience that you could speak to from that front.
Yeah, well, so these folks actually had a really old wood boiler.
Like a cordwood boiler?
Cordwood boiler,
yep.
and it was really bad. It had not been maintained well. It was way too big for their house. It was an indoor boiler. And because they were having so much trouble with it, they were also running oil a fair amount. So I'm not sure if you look at the dollars and cents purely, I'm not sure how much money we saved them in heating fuel. It depends on whether they provided their own cordwood or not. I don't know the answer to that. They're working class folks.
Right.
So they may have been cutting their own wood, but yeah, I'll see if they have that information. I doubt they keep track of it. For them, this was more about, I think they were secret environmentalists. Like they come across as really sort of gruff folks. And I think they really wanted the convenience, but I think they secretly didn't want to make a whole lot of carbon either. So
Sure.
I'll see if I can follow up.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So this guy, like most of our customers, well, all of our modern customers, batch fires his wood boiler. He burns it for 3 to 4 hours, and then he'll coast 12 to 24 hours on the heat that's made. And so, like at my house, if the sun isn't shining for a couple of days, I run out of solar hot water. I'll fire my wood boiler, and I'm good for 4.5 days, even though the wood boiler does its job in about 3 hours. So it's pretty amazing technology. And for people who have their own wood, it's actually a lot more efficient when you look at the whole production of wood pellets and burning wood pellets. Actual home production of cordwood is a more efficient process overall when you look at all the energy inputs. And this particular customer is actually, he has a coil in his hot air system. So he's got forced hot air from his wood boiler. He's got some radiant floor heat from his wood boiler, and he has baseboard. So he was able to handle all those things. And as you can see, he actually installed this himself, and he did a really nice job. All right. Next, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on commercial stuff today, but we do a fair amount of that. We don't install so many commercial boilers, but our dealers do. This picture is a couple of 500,000 BTU per hour boilers. These are boilers that can burn either wood pellets or dry wood chips. I'll explain what a dry wood chip is in a second here. And people would not change their fuel on an annual basis. Usually they would stick with one fuel or another. The changeover is a little bit difficult, and the bins usually aren't made exactly the same for storing the fuel. But we have had customers who started with pellets and then decided that dried wood chips were so much less expensive that they switched. So one of the reasons I wanted to show this slide is that there are 2 boilers, and that is important to note because 2 boilers have a lot more flexibility than one. One of the problems with commercial wood pellet or wood chip boilers is that if you have one boiler that's big enough to heat a school or a commercial facility in the dead of winter, when it gets warmer out, they really have a hard time, and those boilers start burning really a lot more dirty. They're a lot less efficient. So if you can, having multiple smaller boilers gives ultimate flexibility to meet the actual heating load, and to do that with the highest efficiency. Plus, having multiple boilers gives some redundancy. So you have the ability, if one boiler goes down and it happens to be not the coldest day of the year, which is actually quite typical, you can still coast along and keep people warm. So a dry wood chip is a fairly new form of wood fuel. There are, I think, maybe 3 suppliers of dried wood chips in New Hampshire and Vermont. A dry wood chip is basically a chip that is only made from the main stem of a tree. There's no branch wood, there are no needles, there are no leaves, and typically it is hardwood, and those chips are delivered to a dry chip producer. The dry chip producer takes those chips, which are already pretty good, runs them through another screen to make sure that or a sieve, to make sure that they're all very universal in size and shape. Runs them through a magnet to pull out any what they call tramp metal, pieces of nails or screws or ground up vice grips that somebody left in a chipping machine when he was working on it, things like that don't go through a boiler auger, feed auger very well. And then they take those chips and they dry them. They dry them to somewhere between 20 and 30% moisture content. The reason why dry chips have a place in the world is primarily because they can be delivered with much simpler equipment. Air, actually, the most common way is through a 6-inch hose into a bin. So you can have a much smaller trucks delivering to much smaller facilities, and the chips can be stored above ground outdoors, well, under cover, but outdoors, because they don't freeze and clump together the way green chips do. If you've ever been to any of the green chip facilities, there are a lot of schools in Vermont that have these. The storage is generally underground bunkers, big, huge bunkers that are built out of concrete, and there's a big expense to that, and it takes a lot of space. So these dry chip boilers, the fuel costs a little bit more. It's a little bit of a boutique chip, but the infrastructure can be much smaller. So it has a unique niche that's somewhere between a giant green chip boiler and a pellet boiler. Any questions?
What would the cost difference be between like dry wood chips and pellets?
So I actually have this thing that's been absorbing coffee stains on my desk for months. And I keep not throwing it out because it's a handy reference, but let's see if I can decipher it. You know what, I probably can't decipher this math quickly enough for you right now, but a ton of green chips can be purchased for about $50 per ton. And this isn't going to help you. You still have to do some math, but maybe it'll give you a sort of a general impression. So a ton of green chips for $50 a ton has about 8 million BTUs in it when you account for the water. A ton of dry chips costs about $125 a ton and has about 11,500,000 BTUs when you account for the water. A ton of pellets costs about $260 per ton and provides you with about 16 million BTUs per ton. So actually, if you look at pure cost, green chips are the cheapest on paper and in real life. Dry chips are the next cheapest, and then pellets. So it all comes down, when you're trying to decide which one to use, it all comes down to what amount of infrastructure can the space absorb. Is it a huge facility that demands massive quantities of heat? A place like a big manufacturer like, I'm trying to think of a big manufacturer in Vermont that has one of these. For instance, the city of Montpelier has big green chip systems. They're burning so much fuel that they could build big infrastructure. Dry chips.
Electric has a big wood burner. I bet you they use chips too.
Burlington Electric?
Yeah.
Yes, and unfortunately, that is just a pure power application. They don't actually generate usable heat. Well, heat is generated, but it's not delivered anywhere where it can be used. And there's been a lot of talk about that over the years, what it would take to get that into the city of Burlington, because it would increase the efficiency of that plant by about 50%.
That's also subjective too, though, because if they were using biomass and wanted to transfer everybody in Burlington to electric heat, there could be an opportunity there through the McNeil generating system, which I think is what you were referencing, right? The wood chip burning facility in Burlington, Vermont. Yeah. So, you know, there's also that sort of discussion about how you shift that load. So if you could electrify that from a biomass generating facility like McNeil in Burlington, then that could be very different.
But I think some of that McNeil power does go to Burlington, but the problem with burning chips in a power plant is that you're wasting a huge amount of energy through cooling towers. You're only converting about 25% of the energy available in that wood to power. And if you are actually able to capture that heat and deliver it to buildings, the actual conversion of wood is about 75% efficient. So inherently, power plants that use wood without a thermal load are, to me, a poor use of wood. And certainly McNeil is not harming the landscape because it's just one plant and we have lots of wood. But it would not be a smart thing, in my opinion, to try to build lots of wood-fired power plants because it burns the wood too quickly. I don't think it's sustainable from a landscape perspective, and I don't think it's good from a carbon standpoint either.
That's interesting because I know we've had conversations with Adam Sherman about this, and he had indicated that there's a lot of sort of stock in Vermont for biomass. So there
is a lot, and that's why McNeil is not really a damage to the landscape right now. But if there were 10 power plants all pulling fuel from Vermont, then we could start to see sustainability issues.
Sure.
Yeah, Adam's a great guy to talk about this with, and it's probably not inappropriate to say that Adam and I have professionally grown up in this industry together. So I know him well. All right, so this particular slide is a little bit nerdy, but I think for you guys, it'll be easy to understand given your backgrounds. The main point here, or the one thing I want to say is that, again, I don't want to pick on renewable thermal applications. This is not intended to pick on heat pumps. It is purely intended to show that wood heat is sort of the sweet spot for wood heat. And again, I'm focused on forced hot water, okay? This slide is really forced hot water dominated. And the first row is an air source heat pump. It has a maximum, so this would be air to water. So if you had an oil boiler or a gas boiler and you wanted to use a heat pump to heat your heating system, you would try this air source heat pump. The problem is that the maximum output temperature of such a heat pump is about 140 degrees. And most heating systems are baseboard, which require 180 degrees for the coldest temperature. So air source heat pumps have a limited application in air to water applications. They're good for radiant floor heat, where the radiant floor heat is maybe max temperature of 120 degrees. And much better if the radiant floor heat can be run at 90 degrees, which would be radiant floor tubing in concrete. I would have a really hard time putting an air source heat pump, air to water heat pump, in a home that had radiant floor heat under wood, because with wood as your finished floor, you've got to run higher radiant tubing temperatures. And you might get away with that if your house is really well insulated or if it never gets very cold. But the problem with air source heat pumps, whether they be air to air or air to water, as you probably all know, is that the colder it gets outside, the less efficient they are. And if you try to run them at a high temperature during really cold periods of outdoor temperature, they're even less efficient. So they're sort of great for really well insulated homes where you can use low temperature water for heat. For instance, radiant tubing and concrete. Ground source.
Can I jump in, Scott, on this? Yeah. There are some, very simple technologies that we have, like heat transfer plates that, would improve the efficiency, of a radiant floor and wood, the tubing under a wood floor for radiant heat. Instead of, that would allow, more of a greater convective transfer than you get when you just try to staple up, the tubing, and often that's the case.
Of course.
An old farmhouse. So
yeah,
there are things that can, with weatherization and things that can be done. Just to
yes, I appreciate that. So my most recent experience with that very comment or question or topic was a fully gutted farmhouse, basically one big open space except for a bedroom and bathroom, and a couple closets. The guy had gone crazy with insulation, did a beautiful job, and I priced a wood pellet boiler installation with radiant floor heat and fuel storage and so on and so forth. And it was going to be too expensive for him. I think it was, with all the radiant floor heat we had to put in, like we were doing the whole distribution system. I want to say it was $35,000 or something like that. So he said, no, I can't do it. I said, well, would you let me do it with heat pumps? Would you let me quote it? And what I found, first of all, that surprised me is that I had to use more than one heat pump. There wasn't one head that could make the amount of heat that I needed. And then I was planning in all cases to use the contact plates, the aluminum contact plates. But what I found with the heat pumps is I also needed a buffer tank, which was a little bit difficult, just the same way it was for the pellet boiler because he had low ceilings. And then when it got cold out, I was not confident that I would be able to keep his house adequately heated with 120-degree water. I just wasn't comfortable with it, even with the plates and insulation underneath. I gave him the price anyway. I told him, look, we can do this, but that wood stove you have, you might end up needing it on the coldest days. And your price is still $30,000.
Was that based on a manual J calculation or some other calculation?
That was based on a manual J calculation.
Okay.
So I really, in order to get enough heat into the space through the wood floor on the coldest days, we knew that we needed to use water temperatures between 130 and 140. And manual J is pretty solid a way to calculate heat loss, but you actually don't know how each building is going to perform until you live in it and you adjust your heating curves and your temperatures and so on. So, I figured for $30,000, he ought to be pretty darn assured that it was going to do the job. The problem was he had received a quote to do the whole thing with propane for 18 grand from a propane supplier. So we didn't get the job, and the customer was unhappy because he didn't want to burn fossil fuel, but he was also 70 years old, and he said, you know what, I've got a retirement, it's only worth so much, and I'm not doing this right now, and I feel bad about it, but I don't have any choice. So that was kind of a bummer. And I really wasn't trying to make the air source heat pump look foolish. I was trying to make it look great, even though I'm a wood heat guy. I really wanted to do that job, and it was kind of a shame. So with ground source, you have the major advantage is that you don't lose efficiency from your heat pump as it gets colder outside. Of course, the cost goes up more initially. You have more capability. So it fits somewhere in between air source, an air source air to water heat pump and a pellet boiler. But the main thing about the pellet boiler is that it's really good for older homes that have baseboard already, or homes that have forced hot air. And we have the ability to put a water to air coil in the plenum, or add a separate hot air maker. So I guess the point is that each has its own benefit. Like an air source air to water heat pump in a well insulated home with radiant floor heat is going to be the simplest and cheapest thing to operate over the long haul. A ground source is going to be great maybe for bigger buildings with more like multifamily places. I would say that's sort of a tough nut to crack, actually, for single family homes around here. And advanced wood heat is ideal for existing hard to heat homes, which many of them are.
For ground source heat pumps, whether it's for existing homes or whether it's new construction, we always recommend that they kind of think about that in advance, because, or for a retrofit, it's not always cost effective.
Yeah.
Is that what you've been finding in your experience as well for residential applications?
It's really hard. It's really hard because air source heat pumps have become so much better.
Yep.
And they're so much cheaper. If you build your house right, you don't really need ground source. So yeah, ground source fits a unique niche. It's great. It's great when it's in the right application, but I think it's a tough one because it's so expensive.
Well, it has to be a time of construction, really, for residential, in my opinion, because other than that, you're just spending money and you're never going to get a payback.
Right. Right. Agreed. Any more questions about this one?
No, all this is very helpful information.
Okay.
We are looking at the timing is good to get this, because we are have customers that really want to have radiant floor and want to install. You know, they're curious about the air to water heat pumps, and so this is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just realized I'm running way behind time here, so I'm going to start picking it up. I just wanted to show you some of the buildings that are that have advanced wood heat boilers in them. So you have a range of single-family homes. You've got schools. You've got manufacturing, multifamily. There's a museum in there. That beautiful building in the middle there with the blue sky is the Rockefeller Estate in Woodstock. So there's a diversity of opportunities for advanced wood heat. Actually, one of these, in the bottom right, middle right, is actually a small district heating system with, I think, 5 residential buildings, all heated with a central boiler plant, a couple of pellet boilers. So I wanted to get a little bit more into the costs of the fuel. And I wanted to start with this slide primarily because I wanted to show you how household energy costs are distributed. So again, we pay a huge lip service to renewable power, primarily because it's easy and it works so well, but it's a smaller percentage of household expenditure than thermal. Thermal's the biggest one at 44%, even higher than transportation fuel. So if we can help Vermonters to reduce their household heating costs, we're actually making a pretty big whack at their total energy expenditures. This next slide is designed primarily to show you how stable renewable heating is. All the renewable heating lines are down there at the bottom, and you can see they're really barely changed. And so, if you are a budget committee, a town budget committee, or you're a school budget committee, or you are the operator of low-income multifamily housing, and you have a tight budget, these renewable fuel options really are attractive. It just really makes your financial planning so much easier. And historically, not right now, but historically, renewable heating options have also been a lot cheaper over the long run. So the installation, yes, costs more money, but the installation does pay for itself over time, and you have this comfort of knowing that the fuel costs are going to be really stable. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a fun fact here on this slide. There was a big push about 20 years ago called Fuels for Schools that Vermont really took advantage of. It was a Forest Service project. And 1 in 3 Vermont students attend a school that's heated with wood. So we talk about advanced wood heat like it holds a lot of promise, but it also has actually got quite a history in Vermont. And it's astounding that many pupils are in wood heated schools, because you actually don't see the evidence of the wood or these, belching smokestacks when you drive by. This slide I'll go really quickly on. This is just the cost of oil and gas in pellet dollars, pellet equivalency. And so what you can see is that traditionally the red line wood pellets have been fairly inexpensive compared to oil and gas. Of course, now you can see that both oil and gas have dropped lower than the price of pellets, which is kind of sad. And I don't know how long we're going to be in this situation, but incentives from Efficiency Vermont are a big help right now. So getting to the supply of wood in the state of Vermont, this slide is actually borrowed, so it includes New Hampshire as well. But the main point is that Vermont and New Hampshire both share wood baskets, so wood crosses the border routinely. Vermont also gets wood from New York and Canada, maybe even Maine. But the point is that in Vermont, wood is growing at a ratio of 1.7 to 1. So more wood is growing than is being used. Same in New Hampshire, same in Maine, same in New York. It's actually, it's region-wide, this is the situation. And we often don't think about our forest as a factory, but it actually is. It's a factory for recreation. It's a factory for producing clean water. It's a factory for oxygen, and it's a factory for energy. And I think it's arguable that the picture of the forest on the left is a typical forest around here. It is healthy and growing despite producing all of these benefits. Whereas if we hear about a giga battery factory, we get pretty excited. That sounds pretty interesting and sounds like the greatest, newest thing. And I think we take our forests for granted. In fact, I know we take our forests for granted. We do not understand. We're starting to understand that apart from producing all these things, they also have a carbon dioxide sequestration value, and that's starting to be monetized. And there's some excitement about that, because there's always more excitement about money than sort of the same old stuff. But we've been using these forests for decades, and they've been growing and producing for us, and they can continue to do that. And I'm not so sure that the giga battery factory with its lithium mines and cobalt mines can do that in the long run. I think we give the batteries a little bit of a lip service, and they probably deserve, but I don't think we give our forests quite as much lip service.
quick question, Scott.
Sure.
The growth to harvesting rate, which way is that trending? Has the number been higher, getting lower now, or is it going the other way?
It's pretty stable. It's pretty stable at a higher growth than harvest rate. This slide that you're seeing now addresses the bigger problem. The problem is not the harvest of wood for lumber and veneer and energy as a byproduct of those harvests. The problem is that we're losing a huge amount of forest land permanently due to agriculture and development. 65 acres a day, which is just astounding. That's not Vermont, that's New England. But we're losing this massive amount of forest every day. And we're losing it because people don't value the trees. They don't understand the carbon benefit. They can't monetize that. They can't monetize their timber harvest because wood isn't worth that much right now. And so people who hold this land say, what can I do? Like, how can I afford to hold on to it? Well, I'll sell it, or, well, I'll sell a part. And so not only are we losing 65 acres per day, but we are breaking the forest into little bits, which makes it harder and harder to manage and worse for the natural ecosystem. So a lot of people in energy worlds, like our industry, is constantly fighting an uphill battle to try to help people to understand that what we do by burning wood is actually helpful for the forest because we provide intrinsic value, and nobody goes into the woods to cut a tree to burn it. That's craziness. You know, maybe a homeowner does to put in his wood stove, but a timber harvest is made for saw logs. That's where 75% of the value is. There's almost no value in the energy byproduct. So what we do is we provide that extra value to the wood that might someday, if people realize, add enough value so that they don't develop this land. Because once it's developed, it's basically lost for a long, long time. And then we start to lose our fresh water, we start to lose our natural ecosystems, and we may never get it back. So to answer your question, the bigger problem is not lost due to logging, it's lost due to development. And logging is actually one of the solutions to that problem. One of the cool movements right now is to, in the forestry world, and in the policy world as well, is to increase the age of forests so that we're increasing the amount of carbon capture. And some people argue that that cannot be done with active management. People will say, look, you have to stop harvesting the trees. But there are a lot of people that say, no, you can do both. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can harvest the wood products. Those wood products become sequestered in buildings. The carbon is sequestered with it. Even if that wood ends up in a landfill, it's still sequestered carbon. Meanwhile, because you've removed a tree, the trees around it are growing bigger and absorbing more carbon. And that's what this picture shows. Each one of these rings of trees has the same number of trees in it. It's just that they're spaced farther apart. So the outer rings have a massive amount more wood in them than the inner rings. The inner rings are basically shrubs. And so this shows how management can actually increase forest carbon in a very visual way. And I find it very helpful for people to understand how a forest can be managed. And I'm not saying that in New England we should start planting trees in rings or plantations. I don't know, that's not the way to go. What I'm saying is that timber harvests that selectively cut are going to yield product and higher carbon density at the same time. This is another slide that I borrowed from the Energy Action Network. And what it shows is how the money flows in and out of Vermont through the use of different fuels. And, you know, my main takeaway is that when Vermonters spend their money on heating oil, most of that money leaves the state forever. It doesn't circulate around in the Vermont economy. Whereas with wood, the situation is almost exactly reverse. So if you spend your money on wood fuel, that money stays here and circulates around and raises the tide for everybody. Electricity is not so bad either because Vermont makes a lot of renewable power, and that's improving every day, as you all know. Greenhouse gas contributors, you guys have maybe even seen these slides because I borrowed them and you've probably been to these presentations that Jared has made. But the point is that about 30% of greenhouse gas in Vermont comes from home heating. So it's a really important area to focus on for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Have you guys seen this slide before?
Not quite sure.
Okay, so what it shows is the percentage of renewable energy that Vermont now uses. The blue line shows where Vermont's started and where it's made it to right now. The green line terminating at the top in 2050 shows the Vermont goal. And then the intermediate steps along the way. And I like this slide because it shows how much work we have to do. It's sort of startling. You know, it's going to be a stretch in this economy with oil and gas prices what they are to even reach the 2025 goal. Maybe it'll happen on the power and transportation sector alone, but we will never reach the other 40% and 90% goal without addressing renewable heating. It won't be possible. So we got a lot of work to do. There's a big opportunity. Another stolen slide. I didn't steal, actually. I asked for permission. But what I wanted to show you is that the thermal nut is a really tough nut to crack. Carbon. It's a huge part of the CO2 emissions pie, but it's also really hard to fix. You know, we in order to meet the 2025 Paris Climate Accord, there are people in Vermont who think we have to put in 25,000 advanced wood heat systems. I don't know if you guys can see this slide. It's kind of small for me, but 90,000 homes have to be weatherized. 90,000 heat pump hot water heaters have to be added. 90,000 heat pump heating systems. So if we're gonna get anywhere in meeting Vermont goals, it's gonna take sort of an all of the above approach, and it's gonna have to take real action. We can't be the guy who chooses the $18,000 propane system because he feels like that's his only choice. We'll just never get there if that guy doesn't have the choice made easy for him. And I don't know how to change that, but it's an opportunity and it's a challenge. This has been around forever in our industry. As you can see, this goes back to 2012. It's actually really old data. But the point is that if you look at things other than carbon dioxide, if you look at the other pollutants that come from burning wood, we're doing a lot better. Today's wood burning appliances are around 80% efficient on average. And the particulate emissions are so low that they're getting difficult for the test methods to accurately measure. And, you know, we'll never approach oil and gas, but when you look at the big picture, the particulates are a smaller and smaller problem. And I know this graph shows carbon monoxide and not particulates, and they're not exactly the same thing, but carbon monoxide is a pretty good surrogate for particulates. This sort of goes to the one of the prior slides, you guys can read this, so I won't read it to you. But the main point is that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can add carbon to our forests as we make forest products, and that is actually the best way to mitigate carbon dioxide problems. And so if anybody says, look, we're in a climate emergency, we can't afford to burn wood because it takes too long for the trees to grow it back, that is not so. Some people believe it to be so. I do not. The IPCC, which is sort of the world authority on this, does not believe that to be so. This graph comes from a study done by the Northern Forest Center, which is an advocacy group for all aspects of the northern forest, from stable, healthy communities to, well, it's basically about stable, healthy communities, which involves recreation, wealth, clean air, clean water, health. And they did a study because they were frustrated by the fact that people were saying, look, if you burn wood pellets, you're a part of the carbon problem. You're part of the climate emergency problem. And they hired 2 guys to do this study who have nothing to do with the wood industry, respected scientists. And what they discovered is, especially when you take the methane into account that's involved with propane and natural gas, wood pellets are carbon better right out of the gate. This people were saying, look, burning wood is worse than burning coal, oil, or gas. It's not so. It is carbon better right from day one. And as time goes on, as the trees grow back, the carbon situation gets even better. This slide shows you forests over the last couple centuries. What you can see is what you know probably from having lived here, is that the forests were at one point over-harvested between sheep farming and the need for fuel sources. Wood was taken too heavily from the land. And if you look at pictures from 100 to 150 years ago, you see a lot of open fields. And that is indicated in this giant peak in the middle of the graph, where we finally reached a crescendo in terms of wood use. After about 1920, sort of the decline of sheep farming and the advent of coal, frankly, and oil, we started using less and less wood and for fuel. And what we saw is that our forests grew back. They sequestered more and more carbon. At the same time, we started using 3 times as much of that wood for wood products like logs, lumber, veneer, and as a byproduct fuel. And so you can see that we're still on an annual basis adding to the carbon sink, primarily because we're still recovering from that massive loss of forest, and it's actually now fairly stable. We're not changing the rate at which we're absorbing carbon, but we are still absorbing carbon in our forests. I don't have many more slides. This is probably the last sort of wonky slide. In fact, it is the last wonky slide. It again speaks to the concept of carbon over time and the idea of a carbon emergency. It is accurate to say that if you cut a tree down today, the carbon, and you burn that entire tree all at once, it is true that that single tree is releasing carbon that will not be reabsorbed for 100 years until that theoretical tree grows back. That is true. And if you look at things at a micro level, one forest cut, let's say it's a 2.5 acre clear cut, if you cut all those trees down and burn them all at once, you've just made a carbon pulse into the atmosphere that won't come back until that 2.5 acre stand grows back. But if you start looking at the forest on a macro level, where the entire forest is intact and is being cut at various small places in a very small 1,000 places across New England, say. And some of those forests are left completely intact. They're complete wild lands, untouched by man. What you see is that your pulse, your massive pulse, becomes almost static. It's almost becomes a straight line, and that's that brown line. The point being that we can sustainably manage the forest, and from my standpoint, and from the standpoint of the gentleman who created this graph, you can't look at it on a per tree or per stand basis. You have to look at it across the region. And if you look at it across the region, and that region of forest is sustainably managed, it's not a pulse of carbon that you're getting that's going to damage things in the next 10 years. Rather, what you're getting is you're getting a forest that has value, that people are not going to develop at 65 acres a day. And you're going to have the ability to sequester the carbon that's harvested from those forests over time in the form of chairs, tables, buildings, and even landfill wood. So I am not going, this has been a long presentation, and I appreciate you guys sitting with me through a dinner hour. So I'm just going to blow through these. The point, they're just simple slides. The point is just to show you that real people are using this technology now, and they don't have to be a certain kind of person or a certain kind of place. This stuff is viable in multiple buildings for multiple people because it is easy to use. It's sort of a hands-off technology. It's non-threatening, and it's safe. I really want to thank you, and if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask.
I'm all set. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thanks a lot for joining. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Cooper.
Thank you. I thought it was great, Scott.
Thanks, Cooper. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's very helpful. That's good information.
One quick question for you: for pellet supply, I'm not too familiar with it in Vermont. I know where we live, it can be difficult to get a truck to, like, we live kind of between a couple suppliers. Do you see like there being more bulk suppliers coming up soon, or I mean, I guess maybe would you have seen that coming more quickly before low oil prices and whatnot?
Yeah, so that's a really good question.
Hey guys, I'm sorry. I'm gonna hang up. I'm gonna hang up and leave the meeting now.
Okay.
You're good. Thanks,
Take
Michael.
care. Okay. Sorry. Take care.
Bye-bye. So right now, I would say the industry is in a little bit of a struggle, actually, and I don't see it being very likely that there will be new distribution. I think that Vermont has funded at least one truck recently gave some funding to a competitor and friend of mine from Lyme, New Hampshire, so that he can reach into Vermont a little bit better. Historically, we started with one truck, a U.S. Forest Service truck, back in 2001, and we sort of had a chicken or egg. We had this one boiler that could take bulk delivery. There was one truck, and it had to drive all the way from Jaffrey all over New England. I think there are now about a dozen to 20 supply companies.
Okay.
So in 20 years, yeah, the number has really increased, but we're definitely in a tough period right now. In Maine and eastern New Hampshire, we've seen a real contraction in the number of delivery companies. Maine lost, I don't know, 5 delivery companies. We lost 2 in New Hampshire or something like that. So, yeah, we need oil prices and gas prices to go up. I think, without that, we won't see a big build out in the bulk infrastructure.
Yeah, I do think Vermont is definitely there's a market for it for sure. People like to heat with wood here, I think.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so,
one of the problems is also the number of mills. If you don't have mills scattered around the landscape, you have to do these really long truckloads, and the money starts to disappear pretty quick.
I think that's what we bump into a little bit. A friend of mine was looking at a system, and he was calling around to see where he could get supply from, and they're kind of, that people were willing to do it, but it was, kind of like, well, it'd be really nice if there were a couple other people, in your area that were doing it, because that's a long ride for a truck to make one stop.
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk about mills in the Northeast Kingdom, Newport, Orleans. There was that Ethan Allen plant over there, and there was sort of some hope that there would be a wood pellet plant there, but nothing's ever come to pass. Just a lot of talk.
Yeah.
Yep. So there are definitely some holes on the landscape for mills and trucks. But one thing I will say is that the bulk guys will never not have fuel. Sometimes Home Depot has run out of fuel.
Oh yeah.
Some of the big box stores, but there's always bulk fuel.
Yeah, it definitely seems like aside from, like you mentioned, the kind of not really any unforeseen price, increases with it, but definitely a more readily available and secure way to get your fuel for sure.
Yeah, and it's typically been a lot cheaper. It's just that this is sort of a bizarre time for all of us, right? And it's especially bizarre for the energy world.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that's all I had, but I really appreciate it, and I got a lot of good information out of this. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sticking with me tonight.
No problem. We'll talk to you later.
Okay. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.